I think I know what some of you might already be thinking. Out of the 5 videos that currently exist on this channel, 3 of them, technically, have all been on Capcom games. Some of you might be feeling a bit of a pattern or fatigue here, maybe I should just make a video on something else instead, but can you really blame me for wanting to talk about them? Capcom as a company houses one of the most monstrous repertoires of characters and franchises in gaming. The only company I can feasibly think of that has just as much of a baffling amount of distinct quality franchises is Nintendo, and that's saying something. Capcom as a company thrived on bringing some of the most imaginative properties to life in the early NES era and never relented for at least 2 generations of consoles. Properties like Mega Man and Street Fighter were considered video game legends. When you thought video games back in the day, chances are your mind would instantly spring back to those franchises and Capcom as a company who ended up defining the gaming landscape as one of the most revered third-party companies of all time. Nowadays, that is a quality somewhat disputed with the ever-changing landscapes. But up until at least somewhat recently, Capcom were still bringing some incredible hits, one form or another. So it's no wonder that they put out games that are highly interesting to talk about at the detail level. The 6th generation heralded, in my eyes, the apex of Capcom, as well as its unfortunate subsequent fall. And I think 2008 to 2009 stands as the final years in which Capcom went guns a-blazing with some incredible products and attempts at being a company priding in fan service. Starting off early 2008, we got Devil May Cry 4, the sequel to the highly revered DMC3. It's a sequel most people were expecting, and despite a recycled second half, I think most people who played it would agree it has some of the best combat mechanics in the entire medium. In late 2008, Capcom released Mega Man 9, a surprising throwback sequel that was designed to play as if it were one of the NES games. In early 2009, after 11 years since the original iteration of Street Fighter 3, fans were finally graced with a long-awaited True Blue sequel with Street Fighter 4. It took a direction many fans had reservations with, but it's a game that cemented Capcom's now long-standing status as the most commercial fighting game developer. Resident Evil 5 followed not long after that, which, much like DMC3, had an incredible amount of legacy to live up to and hype surrounding it. Much like some of the previously mentioned games, it also had issues, but it was still a well-received game and Capcom still seemed to be looming strong all things considered, making things that were just as informed by corporate purposes as they were fan service. But the biggest surprise of all of these games that came out during this time frame was that Capcom were in the midst of resurrecting a franchise that, aside from a couple of Game Boy spin-offs, had been dormant for 2 decades. One of the most unprecedented choices of a franchise revival, something that made almost no sense to bring back and yet made all kinds of sense. A game that somehow slipped by years of Capcom's countless cross-promotional games and ventures. Seemingly nothing up until now, when Capcom took steps not just to revisit it, but turn it into one of their big-budget franchises. Bionic Commando's history is a strange one to recount, not just because of what's there, but because of what isn't. Originally, the game released on arcade and computer platforms in '87, but that game was wildly different than the Bionic Commando we know today, with more cartoon elements behind it. The game that ended up defining the franchise moving onward was the NES game that released the subsequent year, and there's not a lot of history behind its developers, mostly because of them all using aliases, or much of its development at all aside from its notorious localization. To explain that in part requires talking about the story, so for once we're going to go into this part of the video fairly early. This being an NES game, you'd expect there to not be a whole lot of story to it, but surprisingly it has somewhat of an evolving story, even if it's still completely ridiculous that could have come out of a G.I. Joe cartoon. In the 1980s, a conflict brews between 2 factions referred to as the Federation and the Empire. The Federation learns of a top-secret project that was cultivated by the Empire's predecessors, the Bads, which is only known as the Albatross. In order to find out more about the project, the Federation sends its most revered agent and hero, Super Joe. However, all communications with him is lost and the government ends up fearing the worst. Concerned about his whereabouts and the mission status, the Federation sends one of its Double Force Battalion commandos, Rad Spencer, who has been supplanted with a bionic grappling hook, in order to locate and rescue Super Joe and finish the mission. So let's talk about why this game is so notorious. Much like Resident Evil, this game, initially at least, was never known as Bionic Commando in Japanese regions. Originally, this game was known as Top Secret, referring to the protagonist having to stop a secret deadly weapon. In Japan, the NES version specifically is known as Hitler's Revival Top Secret. This is where things get icky. See, in Japan, the Empire wasn't just your average enemy faction, they were actually a neo-Nazi nation. The game commonly featured swastikas and referred to Nazis very overtly. These things had to be heavily toned down in the West, unsurprisingly considering the platform they were on and the family friendliness that Nintendo were cultivating. Swastikas were replaced with eagles, Weizmann's name was changed to Kilt, Nazis were instead referred to as Bads. And Hitler's name was also changed to Master D. Speaking of that, that's ultimately the game's main plot twist. The Albatross is actually a floating fortress of death that the bads were unable to create. However, the Empire were able to complete the construction with modern resource and technology, yet they were incapable of actually finishing it without certain missing knowledge that only the leader of the bads knows. Which means, ultimately, their entire plan hinges on the simple premise that they are basically forced to, and succeeds in reviving Hitler. Oddly enough, they didn't change this guy's design. Aside from bowlerizing the game like no one else's business, in the West, Capcom wanted to create a connection to one of their previously released games, Commando. Super Joe is actually the lead protagonist of that game, making Commando a canonical predecessor to Bionic Commando. In subsequent modern iterations, Super Joe was retconned into only being the alias for Joseph Gibson, essentially linking the original Commando with its sequel, Mercs. Despite this not being a connection established in the Japanese version of Bionic Commando, this has been universally considered canon ever since. The localization isn't just infamous for the sensitive subjects it changed, but also because of its notorious dialogue. Presumably this was a localization done by the Japanese devs themselves, since it's ripe with typos, grammatical errors, and an incredible lack of irony to what's being said. This is a surprisingly dialogue-heavy game, and despite some characters seemingly talking just for the sake of it, it has its charms. Arguably, this level of camp is the main reason the game got such a cult following to begin with. Aside from its solid gameplay, of course. The gameplay is interesting for many reasons. The most surprising thing about Bionic Commando is that despite being a platforming game, you can't actually jump in it. Your only way of achieving elevation is through your bionic arm. I imagine this had to be a limitation on the developer's part. The NES has only two buttons, one fires your weapon and the other fires your grappling hook. The D-pad, aside from general movement and crouching, also doubles as grapple directions, so assigning a jump to it would probably have been somewhat distracting and deterring. Rad is able to direct his grapple diagonally by default and horizontally and vertically as well depending on where you're directing your D-pad. This system takes a bit of time getting used to, but what's so exciting about it is that it turns platforming into more so of a technical skill. It's satisfying to swing, maneuver, and pull up through obstacles. Bionic Commando was one of, if not the first game to integrate swinging and grappling hooks into a game, and real talk,
grappling hooks are the single best mechanic you can put in a game.
If you want to get me interested in the game, easiest solution, put a grappling hook in it. As I've said in the past, I'm a huge fan of Spider-Man, so you better believe I'm gonna be all over some swinging zipline action. There's nothing quite like the exhilarating thrill of momentum. It's aerial maneuverability based on skill, since you need to attach to proper points in order to get the best out of your swings. Not being able to jump puts a certain degree of emphasis on level design that forces you to be creative in the face of gaps and adversity. It's one hell of a fun game to optimize due to the grappling hook tech involved. Your grappling hook can also be used to deflect enemy bullets, but seeing how most of them always stand upright when shooting, it's easy to just crouch and shoot. The enemy AI isn't the best, but they do become something of a part of the puzzle, since they can descend from upper platforms, and since your health is highly limited with you taking damage off of physical contact, having to flank around enemies can be a legitimate challenge. You can, however, expand your health by collecting the pickups that drop after beating enemies. Your goal in each level is to get to the end of the stage and destroy a power core. To open the doors to the reactor, you need to find a communications room, essentially a checkpoint, and establish contact with the Federation. In the communications room, you're also able to wiretap into enemy territory and discover clues about upcoming obstacles, behind-the-scene enemy operations, or story events. Having said that, there's a possible chance that wiretapping will trip an alarm which will swarm you with enemies, so it's important to keep your guard up. The set of communication rooms might imply that the level design can be somewhat more open, but it's actually fairly straightforward and linear since you're bound to discover them playing regularly through the levels. And at times, they're used as transitional screens as the NES will be unable to render extended vertical or horizontal slices. When you finally get to the reactor core, you'll be faced off with a boss, which can range from being an entire enemy platoon or a sentry robot. The bosses aren't particularly great since they don't often test you on your actual platforming skills, and you're actually capable of just straight up avoiding them if you're good enough since the level only ends after you destroy the core. Beating the level gives you a new weapon or item. While the level design is generally linear, the setup of the game is somewhat non-linear as it employs a map system that allows you to tackle certain areas in any order of your choice, at least to a point. Whenever you descend into an area, you're asked to pick a loadout of gear that you're required to stick to for the remainder of the level. You get the option of choosing your weapon, armor, item, and communicator. This is somewhat of a superfluous system in the original version of the game, as certain active and passive items that are almost designed as upgrades can't be stacked on top of each other. Armor is also categorized by how strong it is, and there's no point in ever having to go back to using lesser versions of it. The weapons are probably where it hurts the most though, not just because of the lack of on-the-fly switching, but because they're horribly imbalanced. Once you get the rocket launcher, and you will get it incredibly early in the game, you have no reason to ever change your weapon. This thing is one of the most overpowered weapons in platformers. It demolishes enemies and even some bosses in one hit, and the rate of fire is too good for the kind of weapon it is. The game sidesteps this issue only once throughout the campaign due to the way the game handles story checks, as the late game area requires the use of a pretty poor weapon to enter it, meaning you're forced to play with that weapon for the rest of the level. You could argue it increases the difficulty, but it only seems somewhat artificial. The communicator devices are finally what's necessary in order to establish proper communications with your base, and there's 4 of them. You need to bring the right device to the right area or you won't be able to open up the door to the reactors. This is something of an interesting gimmick because the hints as to which communicator to bring is something you need to take note of, and while it isn't an exciting gimmick, the idea is still fairly novel. If you bring the wrong communicator to the area, you'll be forced to evacuate and bring the correct one. The communicator devices are located in the game's neutral areas. An area that is denoted with a white icon is considered a combat area or just a regular level, whereas a red icon means it's a neutral area. The neutral areas are generally civilian-occupied peace areas where you're not allowed to fight, even if counterintuitively enough, enemies will sometimes show up and attack you without repercussion. If you fire your weapon, you'll be ambushed by soldiers. These areas contain rooms that have important items to progress, such as the aforementioned communicators. They could also contain clues, one-ups, or even just worthless information. There's not much to them, but as every once in a while asides, they make for decent breaks. A final aside that may hinder your progress is the presence of anti-air enemy platoons that patrol the map. If you cross paths with a convoy on the map, you're forced to drop down and deal with them in a top-down shooter segment. Despite initially not being designed as a sequel to the series, it could be argued that these sections are throwbacks to the original Commando. The benefit of doing these encounters, however, is that the high-power enemies, which vary depending on what kind of terrain it is, drop eagle badges which serve as continues in the case of getting a game over. Beyond that, there's not much else to these, just short bursts of action. When you make it to Super Joe and succeed in rescuing him, he informs you about the Empire's plan to resurrect Master D, and together you make your way through the remaining areas in order to stop the Albatross from ever launching. That said, you arrive too late, as a fascist Generalissimo Kilt has succeeded in finishing the weapon without Master D's aid. As he already cut off the revival process, it seems like we're faced with a confrontation. Until it turns out that Master D had already awoken and murders Kilt to his surprise. Holy crap, is that a curse word in an NES game? Master D seizes control of the Imperial forces and activates the Albatross, culminating in an actually cool boss battle. I mean, with the rocket launcher it's still fairly easy, but this boss actually tests your swinging ability, as the only way of getting to the weapon's weak point is to get into a gap that is surrounded by grabbable thrusters. After destroying the killer weapon, Master D makes a hasty escape, and a dying soldier bestows you with an upgraded bazooka that is able to destroy the cockpit of Master D's helicopter. Depending on who you ask, this is either the coolest moment in the game or the most frustrating, as you have to take a leap of faith with only one chance to blow the cockpit sky high. If you miss, you die. But thankfully Continues will set you right back to that position if you get a game over. And when you get that precise shot, you get one cheesy one-liner in before... Holy crap, did his head explode? Am I still playing an NES game? This is another one of this game's signature moments, and for its time, I have to imagine it had to have been pretty shocking, especially for a wholesome action game. But the battle is not over yet, as the base is set for... and you have 60 seconds to evacuate. This guy shows up again, and you can avoid him, I suppose. The end! You radical madman, you managed to beat Hitler. It's kind of amazing to think that this is something the developers managed to play completely straight-faced all the way through. Bionic Commando cemented itself as a revered NES classic for its great gameplay and crazy story. But despite embodying some of Capcom's most signature traits, something which I'll have to go into detail more at a later time, it seems bewildering that they never tried for a sequel for it, especially when the gameplay has become this lauded and iconic. There were a few Game Boy ports, but that seems a little bit lacking in ambition considering how many other titles made such great transition, isn't it? For 20 years, this lone game was forced to enter into something of a cult status for Capcom, until the news broke in 2007. Bionic Commando was coming back in a modern capacity. Honestly, I imagine many people's instincts was probably, huh? At the time when I first heard of Bionic Commando, it was actually in gaming mags, and I wasn't actively reading into it, but at a surface glance, it was actually quite interesting. It stuck with me in any case, even though I never saw footage of it. Again, this was the time before I started getting into YouTubing and pursuing game trailers, so Bionic Commando kind of drifted out of my conscience. But it returned in full force when I first got an Xbox 360 back in 2008, and when I signed up for Xbox Live. Rearmed was a game being advertised, and my curiosity was piqued. I learned I'd be able to watch the trailer for it to finally see what it was all about, and it was love at first sight. The moment I was able to buy an Xbox Live arcade game, Rearmed became the first game I'd ever get on the service, and it became my introduction to the series as a whole. And now we're finally getting into the deep of it. Capcom had a greater story to sell with the upcoming Bionic Commando, and they also wanted to reintroduce the franchise to those that had not yet experienced it, which was quite a lot of people, me included. They were attempting to tie the game of the past into the game of the present, and where would be a better place to start than a brand new digital marketplace? And since the game was such a revered cult favorite, it made sense to remake the original into a modern age. Initially, Capcom were looking to find another developer to outsource a remake to, but Grin, who were handling the next generation sequel, as big fans of the franchise, wanted to have the hands-on touch to make the transition between games as legitimate as possible. This, if anything, is where the future started looking ever so bright for both the developer and the franchise. Even though I'd already mentioned that I experienced Rearmed before the actual original game, with the benefit of hindsight, I'm primarily going to be approaching Rearmed from the angle of being a franchise revival, which is going to be the main focus of the retrospective on all of the games I'm covering. I think, as a whole, Rearmed has to stand as a golden example to how a franchise revival should be done. I loved this game when it came out, and after having played the NES original, I actually love it even more. For the sake of full disclosure here, I need to admit up front that the original Bionic Commando was my favorite NES game, and the franchise as a whole is arguably my favorite Capcom franchise. I know I've said in the past that Beautiful Joe is my favorite game of all time, and it still is, so it stands to reason that it's probably my favorite Capcom game as well, but I generally hold that game in higher regard rather than the rest of his franchise, whereas Bionic Commando's entire franchise is something I love more universally in terms of characters and gameplay. At first glance, Rearmed might just come across as a graphical upgrade, but things immediately start off in a telling fashion the moment you hit the new game button and when we're greeted with intermission banter going on between your pilot and Spencer, who's received a radical new redesign, making him look like the love child of Iceman and Duke Nukem. Oh yeah, and he has a full name now, Nathan Rad Spencer. Right off the bat, the game is trying to define his characters a lot more. The helicopter pilot, Haley, is a no-nonsense fun partner, and she's really engaging as a character who has some great moments together with Spencer. The original Bionic Commando didn't do much in order to attempt giving his protagonist much character, but Spencer is an incredibly charismatic character in this game who's a wisecracking John McClane type, right down having a backstory about his strained relationship with his wife, even though this is actually just preamble for the sequel. The graphical upgrade is handled very well here, and there seems to have been a conscious effort in replicating the striking complementary color palettes of the original game, which could have been considered a huge risk, since some things in 2D might not translate as well to 3D. But instead, things look exciting and fresh in a familiar way. Rearmed manages to strike a sort of toy-like action figure aesthetic with how its graphics are maintained, and this is incredibly fitting considering Bionic Commando at that point was considered one of the golden eggs of retro video game camp. Capcom has a host of franchises that have hard-to-swallow premises with some ridiculous twists, turns, and conceits that have prevailed subsequent entries in their franchises. But I already talked about once in a Beautiful Joe video how sincerity is what makes those premises come across as endearing and earning of their camp. This is one of the reasons I found it kind of odd that Bionic Commando was not a franchise that Capcom evolved much earlier. The mere fact that you're a hotshot swinging commando who has to battle Hitler is one of the most wholesome concepts to ever burst out of gaming, and such a decisively Capcom-level idea. Having said all that, I do think it might be fair to argue that a certain finesse would be needed to depict that in a good or tasteful way. So who better than a bunch of rogue Swedish developers? This might sound crazy, but I'm actually kind of serious. As a Swede, I'm not sure what it is about our country that absorbs so much love for cheesy pop culture, but I couldn't think of people coming from a better place to design something like Bionic Commando in the modern era. I mean, look at this. The name for the game's shoddy might sound cool, but it is literally just an English onomatopoeia of the Swedish slang word for shotgun. From an outsider's perspective, I imagine it'd be more of a cool name, but knowing the pretext behind it makes it just as hilarious. Presentationally, this game already kicks off on a fantastic foot that plays to the strengths of acknowledging its roots as ridiculous, but still one of its more memorable elements, and the moment you get into the first communications room, the game already presents the player with far more elaborate, colorful dialogue. Instead of information just being informally delivered to you, there's active conversations going on between Spencer and his fellow soldiers at home base. The wiretapping conversations are just as improved too. The great thing about the wiretapping in this game is how the conversations between enemies give a better impression of the Empire being more of a legitimate faction, since we get a bigger insight into their circumstances and beliefs, as well as the good old clues about the coming bosses. These are some of the most fun moments in the game and make for even greater checkpoints in the original. Rearmed manages to build around so many elements that were key to its original iteration's legacy, and it preserves much of its own ridiculous nature in the form of the fun nods and winks to it. Typos and odd choices of grammar are subtly thrown back in when you least expect them, which adds on to the fun writing and how greatly detailed it all is. And while we're still on the subject of the presentation, holy crap, that music! The original Bionic Commando already had one of the best soundtracks on the NES, personally speaking. The great thing about the NES is that with the limited level of channels to use for sounds, they had to make sure that the tracks would be resonant in terms of melody, and tracks had to be approached with the challenge of presenting memorable music despite the limitations. For Rearmed, the composer was actually the game's creative director, Simon Wiklund. Nowadays he's more so known for the Payday franchise, but Rearmed seemed to be the first game that put his brand of work into the spotlight. The soundtrack is pretty much entirely reworked, rearranged, and remixed tracks from the original game, and has an amazing electronic action flavor with some incredible usage of bass. The melodies and production feel distinctly vintage, but many of the sounds are suitably modern. Chiptunes are also highly prevalent, but instead of NES chiptunes, the game seems to use more SID chiptunes, more so known from Commodore 64.
Which is the best kind of chiptunes.
What surprised me is that the Meet the Enemy segments actually remixes Rob Hubbard's Commando theme from the Commodore 64 version, further acknowledging the game's canon relation. You'll have to forgive me for having talked about the presentation so much right now without even having delved into gameplay yet. Considering this is a remake, it's kind of hard to ignore the amount that has changed and adapted. But does the gameplay of the original Bionic Commando remain intact while still being able to evolve beyond just being the game it was on the NES? Well, I don't call this the gold standard of remakes for nothing. The answer is absolutely. The important point to distinguish here is that the original Bionic Commando was a game that was incredibly deliberate. The reason Spencer was unable to jump was not only a controller limitation, but a conscious decision to put more emphasis on level designs that were built around having to maneuver across platforms and enemy encounters with merely your arm. It made platforming so much more of a technical skill, and the risk of changing the deliberacy of something like Bionic Commando is you end up losing the very things that made it so memorable and charming in the first place. As an example of what can happen when this can go wrong, you could take a look at Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes, which is a remake of the original Metal Gear Solid. It has completely revamped visuals and presentation with some expanded gameplay mechanics to go along with it that make it much more fluid to play, similarly to Metal Gear Solid 2. But the cost of implementing those mechanics come at the expense of the level and boss design, which hasn't actually changed to accommodate the gameplay advancements. This makes many encounters, areas, and bosses of Twin Snakes completely trivialized and way too easy because little thought went into the surrounding design of the player. If a game is to be updated, you need to appropriately consider the ramifications of things that change, because otherwise the risk is that it cracks, and the player's enjoyment of it might be tainted by overpowered strategies. This is something that Bionic Commando Rearmed managed to take into incredible consideration. Despite the advancements in technology and control inputs, Spencer still does not have the ability to jump, since that break a large majority of the game's level design. That level design, for the most part, has remained completely intact, but gameplay balance has been tailored accordingly. The enemy AI wasn't the best in the original game, but that doesn't mean that they didn't pose a decent challenge, especially at the start of the game when Spencer would only die after taking one hit. This created something of an imbalance though, because it made the difficulty curve somewhat skewered. While the level design got gradually harder, as is to be expected, the beginning of the game was considerably more difficult than the midpoint. This was because you were at the mercy of your health and lack of good weaponry. The difficulty then takes a nosedive once you get the rocket launcher, and subsequent levels only end up becoming more challenging because of the actual platforming and encounter design, which is ideally where you want the main source of difficulty to stem from. Rearm gets around this by foregoing the health upgrading mechanic and instead settling for a traditional health bar, and this change alone makes for a much smoother difficulty balance. That said, the AI has been upgraded, and they will change cover location depending on yours, as well as being able to fire when crouched. You're also able to grapple barrels and use them as projectiles and shields, and thankfully this doesn't trivialize many encounters since it's a gamble during skirmishes when you're surrounded. The game's neutral areas have been heavily changed. Rather than being civilian-occupied zones, they are now FSA camps, meaning no enemies will show up and you won't be ambushed by firing in the area. Talking to the soldiers yields more elaborate conversations, and the rooms you find here usually yield more substantive content, such as there always being at least one up in one of the rooms to obtain. Aside from the standard items you are meant to obtain here though, they've now added unlockable challenge rooms here, which can be considered bonus levels or trials. This is where the designers have been allowed to go nuts with brand new level designs that test you on your intricate grappling abilities, and is a great new incentive even for those familiar with the original game's levels to challenge themselves. The loadout system has been improved tremendously, as in it doesn't exist anymore. Accessories that granted you passive upgrades are now integrated as just regular character upgrades that are applied when you obtain them, so things like the iron boots are actually useful now. The same principle goes for the armor you get, and the communicator devices you gain now regularly stack as well. But the biggest improvement by far the game provides is the weapons. This is such a welcome change and attributes to the balance of enemy encounters. You're actually able to actively switch between your weapons and levels this time around, and each weapon has been retooled to be more useful individually. The starting revolver sees a heavy level of usage mainly because it's a fairly decent long-range weapon. Despite only being able to have 2 bullets at a screen at once, it also does more damage to human enemies. The second weapon you get is a new plasma cannon which fires incredibly fast and at a rapid pace. The downside of the weapon is that it does subpar damage to human enemies, but since plenty of enemy types have changed and been added, it does more damage to mechanical enemies and can also take out enemy shields easily. The rocket launcher has been severely nerfed, but I can't help but think that this is a good thing. It's been replaced with a bazooka that fires accelerating warheads. Its rate of fire is incredibly slow, the wiggly angle makes it a bit risky, and it now has a splash damage that can also damage Spencer. But it still has a ridiculously good damage output and becomes pretty handy for some bosses. The wide cannon, arguably the most useless weapon in the original game, has been replaced with a traditional shotgun, and it's just what it says on the tin, small range for incredible damage. The 3-way has been replaced by a unique vector cannon which fires shots diagonally and rebounds on walls, making for a pretty good weapon to use against airborne targets. Finally, Joe's signature machine gun, which was pretty abysmal in the original game, is now a ridiculous all-round weapon that dispenses a heavy level of damage, but is also the only weapon with a reload timer leaving you vulnerable. Every weapon has an upside and a downside to it. They're easy to understand, easy to apply, and are all suitable for different situations and encounters. They also all have individual upgrades to them, which can be found in new secret areas, which is where most of the game has upgraded its existing level design. There's been some incredibly crafty changes and subtle additions to the familiar levels that ask you to think outside of the box in order to find hidden object or power-up. This includes the presence of Capcom's signature Yashichi collectible, and much like DK coins in the DKC series, there's one in every level. Collecting them all only really serves to give you a bonus in the 2009 sequel, but it's still a fun challenge nonetheless. At the same time that enemies have gotten improved and added upon, the same goes for the bosses, and man oh man, Bionic Commando Rearmed has some incredible bosses that blow its original iteration out of the water. These are bosses that regularly challenge you on all of the gimmicks you've learned and employed, and they're really fun to actually fight. Despite the game reusing every boss once, I can forgive it since the game consistently provides every level with a boss, and the revisits make them much harder and challenging. Several of the bosses that have clearly been brought back from the original have been completely changed to make for more interesting fights, and the amazing banter that was present in the communications rooms is just as prevalent here, as Spencer trades some amazing lines with his opposition. Again, all of this adds on to the incredibly fun and colorful presentation that makes the concept of being a character taking on an entire warring nation to feel legitimate, and I highly respect this kind of level of thought. Spencer is like a one-man army, and Bionic Commando has in a way become something of an embodiment of 80s action flicks such as Commando, Cobra, and Escape from New York, where a wild card is the only hope left for our heroes. Interestingly, the Wired Gunner, who was considered one of the hardest bosses in the original, has been replaced by a fellow Bionic rival named Groder. This is still partially setting up the sequel, but it makes sense to have a more defined foil. And if you see my Beautiful Joe video, you know I love me a good old-fashioned rival or mirror battle. Around the late game, we finally rescue Super Joe again and find out that in this version of the game, Master D is only known even more ambiguously as the leader, and the game heavily lampshades the ever-so-secret knowledge of who he is actually meant to be. This isn't too surprising considering that this twist was one of the game's absolute signature moments, and it makes for a funny tongue-in-cheek acknowledgement of the fact that yes, it's obvious that this is Hitler. But what is surprising is the fact that the Albatross isn't just a seemingly super-powered flying weapon. In Rearmed, Albatross is an entire massive airborne fortress, which means that Rearmed is actually giving us a brand new level. And what a level it is. Aside from Albatross, there are a few extra levels in the game. The hidden passageways from the original game have changed into being actual extra levels, which are hard as nails, but still some incredible challenges. The Albatross, though, is an ultimate test of your swinging abilities, as you're put into several rooms and areas where you're forced to apply everything you've learned in regards to swinging and combat encounters. It's a way more rewarding final level in comparison to the initial final level of the original game, which only really felt more like build-up than a challenge considering everything that came before it. And finally, where the original game had a nondescript soldier give you a bazooka to do a one-chance leap of faith to destroy the leader's helicopter, Rearmed uses its final encounter as a way to round out the ongoing character relationship between Haley and Spencer, when she's tragically shot down. With only one last moment together before she passes, she gives him the final upgrade of the game, the bazooka upgrade. If you're someone who's already played the original, then the tense moment of anticipation already prepares you for what's to come. The leader isn't necessarily the best boss battle in the game in terms of the challenge it proposes you with, but considering the Albatross level was an extended test of your abilities, this boss battle is pretty much the best way to round it all up, as you need to blow up the leader's helicopter by aiming rockets into the cockpit. And after a few good hits, the monster's number is finally up. While you've been dealing with the remaining forces of the Imperials and the leader, Joe has been working behind the scenes to bring the Albatross down from the sky. But time is running out as your progress gets impeded by Croter, who survived the previous encounter and tries to prevent your escape, but he quickly abandons after the going gets rough. With little time to spare, Joe and Spencer successfully escapes the collapsing fortress, victory has been assured, the world is at peace, and a new friendship is born. Bionic Commando Rearmed was released to highly critical acclaim, and for good reason. It put a long-dormant franchise back into the spotlight while simultaneously understanding how to maximize and improve on all the memorable qualities and design choices that made it such a revered cult classic in the first place. In a way, it was the ultimate rebirth and the perfect storm. It was a video game that capitalized fairly early on the premises of nostalgic prevalence and justified why people hold such concepts in high regard. At this point, the ball was in Grin's playfield. They had proven themselves capable of handling as sensitive of a franchise as Bionic Commando with the dignity it deserved, and it was up to them to continue its legacy, which seemed like a perfectly reasonable, deserved decision at its time. For a while, everyone was happy and everything seemed perfect. What could possibly go wrong? The future of Bionic Commando would yield 2 more games. One that, at its time of release, became one of the most divisive games of all time, and one that, with the benefit of hindsight, would end up arguably becoming the most self-consciously tragic game that Capcom would ever release.